What does a defining moment look like? That tipping point between looking back and moving forward, between celebrating the past and boldly defining the future. At the United States Air Force Academy, defining moments have taken many forms. In 1959, the Academy commissioned its first second lieutenants. In 1976, female cadets were first admitted. And in 2020, the first graduates were commissioned into the U.S. Space Force. The Academy now arrives at another defining moment, and its mission has never been more important. As the Air Force Academy looks to the future, it is faced with an increasingly complicated, interconnected world, one marked by unprecedented advancements in technology and shifts in culture. And it stands ready to provide tomorrow's leaders with the intellectual capacity, strength, and resiliency required to confront the challenges of our time. To help them prepare for these challenges, the Air Force Academy Foundation and the Association of Graduates together are undertaking the most significant comprehensive fundraising and engagement campaign in the Academy's history. This bold vision is our defining moment for the Academy. New partnerships will spur academic innovation in the classroom and attract nationally recognized scholars. Advancements in human performance and world-class facilities will push cadet athletes toward greater moral and physical development. An enhanced focus on interpersonal leadership and the future of the profession of arms will accelerate individual cadet growth. More opportunities for alumni engagement will help invigorate and fortify the long blue line as it strengthens its connection to the Academy. Private support will help achieve these goals, offering each cadet the richest academic, military, and athletic experience that readies them for leadership. With your help, we are defining the future for the next generations of the long blue line, the future airmen and guardians, pilots, astronauts, and doctors, CEOs and entrepreneurs, lawyers and teachers, inventors and investors, ministers, public servants, and coaches. Leaders. Join us.
Hello, and welcome to today's Sabre Society Speaker Series conversation titled Developing Excellent Leaders from Cadets to the C-Suite. My name is Dr. Douglas Lindsay, class of 1992, True Blue 92. I'm honored to be invited to moderate today's conversation with Brigadier General Retired Dana Bourne, class of 1983. Today's conversation is brought to you by the Association of Graduates and the Air Force Academy Foundation as a way of recognizing your support to the Academy. Allow me to introduce our special guest today. Brigadier General Retired Dana Bourne is the faculty chair of the Senior Executive Fellows Program, the faculty advisor for the Black Family Graduate Fellows, and lecturer in public policy. She also served as co-director of the Center for Public Leadership at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. She is also a distinguished fellow for moral leadership at the Howe Institute for Society. During her 30 years in the Air Force, General Bourne served 2 terms as the Dean of Faculty at the United States Air Force Academy and was a permanent professor and head of the Department of Behavioral Sciences and Leadership. She was also the commander of the 11th Mission Support Squadron at Bolling Air Force Base in Washington, D.C., and served in Afghanistan in support of Operation Enduring Freedom. General Bourne earned a Bachelor of Science in Behavioral Sciences from the United States Air Force Academy, a Master's in Science in Experimental Psychology from Trinity University, a Master's of Arts in Research Psychology from the University of Melbourne, and a doctorate in Industrial Organizational Psychology from the Pennsylvania State University. She serves on a wide variety of public, private, and nonprofit boards, including the Air Force Academy Foundation and the Falcon Foundation. General Bourne, thank you for joining us today.
All right. It's wonderful to see you again, Doug, and so good to be in this space with fellow Sabre Society supporters and a topic of leadership. Wow, we're going to have a great conversation.
I agree. And it's a special treat for me, having been under your leadership for many years and mentorship as well as your executive officer, and you selecting me for my PhD slot at Penn State as well. So it's great to see things kind of come full circle here.
Yeah, absolutely. And Doug, I know we shared a little bit of a memory when you were the officiant at my change of command when I assumed in 2004 the Dean of the Faculty responsibilities. And I remember both of our daughters dressed in Air Force battle dress uniforms with little pink tennis shoes. And one is now a Marine officer after graduating from the Naval Academy, and the other one is Air Force Academy graduate and on her second master's degree and flying as an instructor pilot of helicopters down in Alabama. So time flies, and look at you now helping us and our institution with the incredible work of the Journal of Character and Leadership Development. So great to continue our work together.
Absolutely. And actually, as a former Falcon Foundation scholar as well. So thank you for your serving on that board and other folks as well. It's fun to be involved in many different ways.
Fantastic, and see the difference that can make and in your one life, and certainly the foundation has helped so many others. And I think that's our conversation today, of really boosting up our boosters and have a conversation about learning and leadership that just doesn't stop when we graduate and throw our head in the air, and it doesn't stop when we change our way of service, whether we're in uniform or in the C-suite, as we put for the topic for today.
Absolutely. And it all builds upon one another, right? It's kind of that lifelong journey that we do. And so we started obviously while we're here at the Academy, but then we just keep building and building. And I look forward to hearing your thoughts about that as we kind of continue this conversation in terms of what you do to continue your development as well. But I was wondering if we could start kind of with a basic question about if you could explain a little bit about your journey and maybe some of those significant lessons that you've learned along the way that have helped you in your leadership. Since we're talking about from cadets to the C-suite and it all kind of builds upon, are there a couple of pivotal moments that you remember from your journey or that really were pivotal for you in your leadership development?
There are, and Doug, that's a great question. And I hope our listeners are also asking themselves, how would they answer that question? Because this is a journey we're all taking together. And for me, as you and I had a conversation before the journal launched, and when you were working on helping to build the conceptual framework for the Air Force Academy, I remember saying that my best lessons in leadership were those times where there was either failure or something didn't go as planned or as hoped. And I felt a little bit like I responded to that, saying that is actually the truth. And some of that is what made parts of my career probably the most formative, were the really rough parts. In particular, I think about commanding at Bolling Air Force Base at a time when, we were mostly a support command, but then who would have had imagined, the terrorism that we all experienced on 9/11 and having a contingency response that was required. And another is, and it wasn't that much long after that, was the sexual assault, sexual harassment challenges that we at the Air Force Academy, but quite frankly, everybody faces. I'm still working those issues as a Title IX appellate at Harvard University. Those were some very difficult times. And I think my blood type is B positive, and I'm kind of like a cup half full person and an optimist. But those were maturing moments for me as a leader, where I became a lot more, trust but verify, and I think a lot more vigilant in terms of trying to notice to expect the unexpected, but also to be ready and to ensure that those that are entrusted to my leadership are ready. Education, training, exercising, practicing. And one of my colleagues at the Harvard Kennedy School, Juliet Kayyem, you may see her, or our listeners see her and hear her on CNN quite a bit. She wrote a book called The Devil Never Sleeps. And it's all about the fact that the right side of boom is going to happen. And so what are we doing to prepare for the inevitable in this kind of environment that we are and our graduates are leading in? And I think finally, maybe the most important is recognizing how important character is, as well as caring. And I think that these moments actually brought that to life even more for me in my leadership and in my learnings, is making sure that, I'm living that life of character and example that I want to see in others, and caring in a way that I want to be cared for. How do we pay that forward during some of the toughest times? It's probably the most important.
Thanks for sharing that. I wonder if I could pick apart that a little bit more and go a little deeper. So you talk about the importance of preparing, obviously really important about, when we talk about character, knowing who we are, knowing what we stand for, knowing what's important for us, and then the importance as leaders to develop others and develop that capacity. How have you found, like in the moment of, like I said, the agenda for change, when you were called in here to do that 9/11 and having to respond to that, what was it that you think set you up for success to be able to kind of not only process that in the moment, because there's some personal things that you've got to kind of sort through and think through that, but then be able to kind of lean in and lead others as well? What do you think, what did you lean on to really be able to kind of show up the way you wanted to be fully present in those moments?
Yeah, I will answer it based on, reflection now and a lot of great advice I received over the years. But one of them is, and this is proven through some leadership, that when we're in crisis or when we're in a place where it feels overwhelming, one of the things that can help us get from that automatic response that we have as humans of the fight or flight or freeze is to think about what our role is. What is my role as a commander? What is my role as a dean? What is my role as a parent? What is my role as a teammate? And that helps us to get into, sorry for the psychology term, but the frontal cortex, which is our, decision making, and it allows us to act, which is important in times of crisis, that we're doing something. And I saw that play out. 9/11, myself, I had a 4-month-old and a almost 3-year-old in the Pentagon daycare. We didn't know if the daycare had been hit. We didn't know, the status of our colleagues. And yet at the same time, I knew that I was responsible and we had a mission. And, some of our airmen were going through the same kind of concern and fight or flight or freeze. We had one airman who actually collapsed, who was critical to our mission success. And that was even after training, right? And preparing. People knew what they had to do when something happened, even though we did not believe anything would ever happen. And so it's a real thing to have that human response to fear, or to where courage is required to step into our roles. What I think is the hardest thing is to not, if you have that role, is to not take things personally, because it's hard to not do that. And I think the other part of that is if things aren't going as well, is just to find a way to make them go better together. I think the other is keeping a vision on what is success, seeing yourself on the other side of the crisis situation, being successful, and looking back and not saying or doing anything that might harm that success. And that's through wisdom of, some of the crises I was in through those time periods of people saying, you got to see yourself on the other side of this, and looking back. And that was very wise advice I've tried to pay forward and pass on.
I appreciate you sharing that, and that you really talked about that kind of that human response and how we kind of respond in the moment. As we think about being a leader, we're going to have that. But I think in a way that human response, or being able to be going through that ourselves, as well as understanding what our role is, really helps people to understand our authenticity, really be transparent that we're in this together, right? We're not robots going through this, trying to have these predictable responses, right? We don't necessarily, in my opinion, need our leaders to be perfect. We just need them to be present, to be trying, to be working through those processes, even if we're only half a step ahead, right? Or maybe we're in lockstep and we don't understand that ability to be able to kind of be human in the moment and trying to work through that, right?
That's a very important lesson, Doug. And, we're on the hero's journey, many of us, right, to be perfect and to show that we're capable and competent. And what happens is we put ourselves up on a pedestal where people either can't relate or they start looking for the chinks in the armor because they know that humans aren't perfect. And so they start looking for the imperfections. So it's hard to be vulnerable, but vulnerability is a strength when we're human. People see the humans in us, and we can then better be in a position to see the human in others.
Right. When do you think that idea of that kind of understanding of that kind of humanity as well as the role, where do you think you learned that kind of on your journey in leadership from cadet to where you're at now? You've had a lot of success. Where do you think that kind of came into being? Was it a personal thing? Was it a professional thing? How did you kind of come to that point?
Yeah, I think it's something that evolves over a lifetime. The word that comes to mind for me to answer your question is humility, and humility and service are kind of the same virtues. And I think that as we're more humble or we embrace humility, that we are more other oriented. And I also think that our purpose has a significant role in that, because our purpose is less about I or me, although the I and me is very important in our leadership and our own journey to setting an example and living our purpose. But it's really about what we are part of or who we are helping that's beyond ourselves, the we part of the journey. And I think that's also key, service and humility.
Well, and I think that gets back to your point, or at least as I hear you say that idea of what success looks like. I think early on in our careers, it's about what I can do or a position or maybe a promotion. But I think as we grow as leaders and as we understand that role a little bit more, that success factor of helping others show up better, being better equipped, developing others and their capacity as well becomes a little bit more important part of that success criteria, right?
I love that you brought up success, because I write a lot about how important intentionality is. And, as a second lieutenant, intentionality and success meant something different to me, maybe to you, maybe to our, other graduates that are online. And I still remember, because people asked me when I was the dean, when you were a cadet, did you ever think about being the dean? And I said, well, no, neither would my classmates have thought that. But I actually, as a second lieutenant, did plot out, because I was prompted to by a captain who was mentoring me, to say, plot out, your life career, put in where your developmental education is, if you're planning on getting degrees in what, and, where you want to be in 20 years time. And that was like success. What is that trajectory? And later I realized that success, we can define success how we want to define success for our lives. Ultimately, writing the history. I love this phrase, write the history of your future. And then what do you need to do, to achieve that, right before, whenever, all the way to today, writing the history today for our future. And ultimately that could be, how do you define success for your last breath? And what is that dash in between the day you're born and the day you take your last breath? How do you define success? And that can lead us all the way to, how are we living that today? It can be about purpose, my answer to who am I and why am I? And how am I living that more each day, which takes courage and it takes practice, habit. It's that ancient Chinese philosopher in the waterfall is, watch your thoughts, they become your words become your actions become your habit becomes your character, and your character becomes your destiny. That's Lao Tzu. And that's wisdom in terms of writing the history of our future, in even how we're thinking today about what success is for ourselves and for influencing others ultimately to have significance in our lives.
Right. And I love that theme of intentionality because it keeps us connected to that process and gives us some agency in that, right? Because otherwise we're not a kind of a victim of the moment. We're not just being responsive to what's happening to us. We actually get to be part of that. Now, we may have a lesser role at different times depending upon where we're at, but we always have some sort of input into that process of kind of writing that history. We may not exactly be like, for example, your 20-year point on your 20-year plan may have been a little bit different than when you had written it as a cadet. But my guess is the intentionality in the process did help some of those ideas come to fruition, right?
Absolutely. And there's a lot of research that backs that up. And ultimately, I didn't plan on doing a 30-year career. So I didn't plot it out long enough. But I think you're absolutely right. It's the process of when you write something down, particularly if it's something authentically important to us, we're more likely if we write it down to achieve it. I mean, a lot of the research shows that even voting turnout, if you're asked where you're going to vote, when you're going to vote, where you're going to park, who's going to take you, you're more likely to actually follow through with voting. I think we as individuals, if we put down something that matters to us, we're more likely to be energized towards writing the history of our future there.
Right. And then reflecting on it, right? That intentionality with it in terms of wanting to do that, but then kind of coming back to that from time to time and thinking about where it is, because I think from day to day, sometimes we can get a little bit worn down of that kind of that grind sometimes, and we forget kind of some of the progress that we make. So being able to kind of reflect back on kind of where we started and where we're at, we may be in a different place than maybe we thought we were going to be, but we still have made progress on that developmental journey, right? In terms of who we say we are.
So important. And that is the, ongoing, lifelong learning, as you put it earlier, is, even self-awareness, right? It's not like I'm self-aware, you check a box. It's an ongoing journey of becoming, like, the more we know we don't know about ourselves, but it's the process of being curious. What are our values? How are we living our values? How are they prioritized? So that, we take into consideration what other people think, but they don't define us. We actually have a pretty good, clear set of what our values are. What are we motivated by? What's your fire in your belly? What are the carrots that are attracted to you? They're different for each of us. And so that journey of understanding that, but going back to those questions is the process I think you're pointing out that is so important.
And understanding those questions change, right? It's kind of the old Marshall Goldsmith, right? What got you here won't get you there. And so it's that the beauty of this whole developmental process is that we get to continue to find ways. It's not like, oh, I just get a little bit better and then I just spend 30 years refining that little bit. It's literally trying to figure that out. I think David Day put it kind of eloquently, right? You get into a position of leadership and you feel like you're doing really good, and maybe you're a 7 or an 8 or a 9 out of 10, and you go, okay, I feel like I'm pretty good. And then kind of as you move up, you realize that the scale changes a little bit and it's not out of 10 anymore, it's out of 100. And that 7 or 8 out of 10 isn't so good at 7 or 8 out of 100. So how do we continue to grow and develop and move and think about that? It's just that constant wanting, but also, as you mentioned, going back to what our values are. What is really important to me? Am I just doing this for the repetitions, or am I really being able to kind of find out what my passion is, find out what my values are, and I'm really being consistent with that, right? I think that's something important to kind of keep in line and kind of gives us an azimuth as we go through, right?
Absolutely. A true north, a compass, often those are terms, but it's also the fact that wherever we go, we are there. And so what does it mean to adapt to different circumstances, different contexts, different industries, different times of our lives, and not lose ourselves? And so that's a very tricky thing. And I learned it the hard way because, I mean, I'll give one of my failures was going from being what I would have said is a fairly successful commander during crisis, during 9/11. in, recognized by the people who were recognized in my unit, a good number of them for going above and beyond for how we responded to fulfill the mission. Ultimately, I went on to do another, 10 plus years of service after that. And yet when I got to the Air Force Academy, the style that worked really well in that industry with mostly young airmen who are, fairly young, looking for a lot of direction, went really well. I took that style to the crisis of the sexual assault, sexual harassment at the Air Force Academy, leading the Department of Behavioral Sciences and Leadership, which was a smaller unit, but mostly PhDs. And that style did not work very well. So I had to learn, through the humility and the, that lesson of, this isn't working. How do we make it work? And asking for brutal honesty and asking for feedback to not necessarily change my values, but to help me learn what wasn't working and to be able to adapt in that circumstance to be more effective together.
Right. And I think, and we probably all have some examples of people who, I think that speaks to that kind of genuineness of wanting to be the right leader at the right time there, because I think sometimes we see people who are not able to take that step back, ask for that honest feedback to be able to say, hey, how am I doing here? To go, hey, no, I've been successful in the past. I'm just going to keep doing it and doing it and doing it. And what we realize that, it's not that you're different as a leader, but how that manifests itself and what those interactions are a little bit different because they need something a little bit different, right? Those
true.
PhDs needed something a little bit different from you than the airmen who really kind of needed to know what was going on, right? So what was that?
Absolutely.
What was that like, or how did you, once you had that awareness, they're still taking the steps to make it happen. So how did you find the way to do that kind of real time?
Yeah, well, and it's ongoing, Doug, because to go from, the military to then I'm now in my 11th year at Harvard, and I serve on many different boards, and each of the boards, whether it's the airline industry, the energy industry, educational industry, nonprofit, public, for-profit, the cultures are different. And so, that I think the key message there is the recognition that, we are personally on a journey of who are we, why are we? The context that we are trying to create positive influence within is different. And how do we adapt, again, without losing ourselves? And I think that's where we can be most effective. And also, that's the part of, what you bring to a situation, your gifts, your strengths, and each of us, have different things that are what we bring. And so it enables us to not have to be somebody else, but to be our best selves in developing in order to adapt to and contribute to multiple different scenarios, situations, contexts, day to day.
I think that's important because that allows us to be who we are, right? We go back to our values, our character, and who we are. It's not like we're changing who we are as those contexts change. A lot of how we show up, but again, how we interact and how we influence is going to look a little bit different. But we carry that kind of idea of our leadership and who we are with us, even if they're in those different contexts. So who you are as a person likely didn't change when you moved from the dean over to Harvard and in your other domains, but how you manifested that, how you thought about that, what aspects of those needed to show up at different times. Certainly that's going to be contextual and cultural within the organization that you had, right?
Yeah, and it goes back to that authenticity. And, authenticity is probably an overused word. And there was a meta-analysis that came out in 2019 that shows that, it's tripled, I think, in terms of our way that we're using that word in our research, whether it's marketing, management, psychology, sociology. So I looked it up in the dictionary, and actually the word is original. And I really like that a lot better because, even and you're a twin. And I think even identical twins, there are differences among identical twins. So originality really seems to resonate with me.
No, I think so. Right. I think about my brother as well. Yeah, we kind of started out the same genetically and others, but we certainly have come a different path based on, I think we're probably both centered the same way, but how that looks is a little bit different. Me going up through a behavioral science environment and him going up through OSI in the military, that just did have a different influence in terms of how we show up and that kind of originality of who we are. And I like that aspect of kind of being a little bit different, being unique in that way. And I think whereas I think you're right, we do overuse that word. It is nice to see that the field has drifted over time to really understand that kind of individual component instead of, I think there for a long time, leadership was a lot about the traits or the types and the different things that we are instead of understanding kind of our own unique person that we bring and our views and our values and our purpose and all those things that you talked about, how we enact that into our leadership position. You're successful today for a lot of reasons, but a component of that is what you faced when you were at bowling in DC, what you faced when you were the dean, and how you brought all that together to where you're at right now, and the work you're doing with the Howe Institute and the Kennedy School and all of those all help to round out who you are and how you're showing up and what's important to you, right?
Yeah, and I look at, you were talking about that in the arc of the way that we've thought about leadership development. You brought up the point of, the great person concept, right? That you had to have a certain, traits, and boy, that was so wrong. And then we, had transactional. I mean, when you were going through, and many of our listeners probably going through the Air Force Academy, it was very much a transactional carrot and stick approach between leader follower with consequences kind of leadership. And it wasn't until the early 2000s that we moved more into that, what Bass talks about as transformational leadership, where we're focused on, individualized consideration and motivation and things like that. And now my word for it is, because there's so many, but it's really getting back to the transformative kind of leadership, where it is mostly internal work. And it's leveraging the I and the me. There is a me and team. It doesn't stop there, but what each of us brings individually to any collective effort. Matter of fact, David Day, who was on my dissertation committee from the Pennsylvania State University, and you quoted him earlier, great work there. He uses the word leadership, and I put ship in parentheses because leader development is really our personal development. And leadership development clearly is the constellation of stars, right? It's the collective social capacity work. And it's very much, I know, the foundation of the work you did in the conceptual framework for the Air Force Academy. And so it's sort of a continuum, but it's the I and the me, put our own oxygen mask on first. That's wise advice on an airline. And it's because if you do the noble thing, right, to give it to the person next to you, you're not going to be around to do much good for the rest of the time. So I do like that I and me to we, thinking about the leader development and the leadership development in our journeys and the evolution of the way we think about now leadership development.
No, I like that you said that, because we also see a lot of conversation around the idea of kind of this idea of mindfulness and wellness, and really that investment in ourselves. And if we are not kind of, there's both of that, right? There's what I do and who I am and how that interacts into the environment of my leadership. But if I'm not doing what I need to do to invest into myself and take care of myself, then I'm less able to show up to support the team and the leadership and be part of the we there. If I just think it's about the I and what I bring to bear, then I'm just one stumble away from the whole organization or the team falling apart, right? But if it's part of that larger collective and what I'm doing, and part of, the job of leadership is to develop the future leaders that come after us to replace us, if we really understand what that's about, then it really does become generative. And like you said, that kind of that transformative aspect of it, right? It's like, what are we creating, and what are we able to kind of co-create? And again, Dave talks about that social capacity. What are we doing to help create the overall leadership capacity of the organization? Not just me, because again, if it's just about me, then like I said, one stumble away from not being who the organization needs me to be, and then I'm holding them back instead of really empowering them to be what they want to do.
Critically important. And since we talked about this as from cadet to C-suite, that becomes increasingly more important as you're entrusted to other people's wellness, right? So,
Right.
Taking care of yourself, and what happens when people get into really big jobs, and the taking care of self sometimes takes a back seat to all the responsibilities. And, Doug, this because you've been so wonderful in building up the Journal for Character and Leadership Development. And I've really enjoyed participating in helping others to learn about what we're learning about in terms of character and leadership. But the research we've had going on at Harvard now, which is for the last since 2014, we've been focused on how the influence for all levels, whether it's undergraduates, graduates, executives, senior executives, by influencing their work on authentic leadership and developing, their purpose, how does that influence their stress levels and well-being? And we have found in online as well as on campus, pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, and now that we're back on campus, I'm not so sure I can say post-pandemic because COVID is certainly still among us, but we're actually finding that through the pedagogy, through the practice of reflection, and through the practice of doing this, what is your life story? What motivates you? What are your values? Why are you? What is your purpose? That we have actually been able to increase growth mindset, decrease stress, increase wellness, as well as enhance self-concept clarity and purpose in life. And so we're now just exploring how do we make sure that sustains. We know it sustains at least a week or two after the program, but how do we ensure that it sustains for a lifetime, which is what transformative means. That's the foundational work that is not just a blip after going through, an intense experience.
Right. And I think that's where that intentionality comes in. It's where that feedback comes in. It comes in that assessment. And I think really getting to that point of connectedness and it's all together, I think, is where it's really important. I think a lot of times where we see leader failure or where leaders kind of derail or get off track, it's where they kind of get into some of these isolationist type things. They kind of get away from that connectedness and they kind of are in their own silo where they feel like they're by themselves and they lose that connectedness. So those kind of acts of discretion end up happening more often because they don't really realize the connectedness and the impact back to other people because they've either kind of siloed themselves or walled themselves off or felt like, oh, I'm the leader by myself. And when we lose that connectedness, then we lose that ability to kind of go, how am I acting or interacting around other people, or not asking for the feedback that I need, right? When we look at things like 360 feedback and you're doing executive programs and a lot of what you do is a lot of them, there's a big difference between those that are open to that feedback and those that are not open to that feedback. And then those whole ideas of connectedness, right?
Yes, and there are some barriers to growth, and we usually put them upon ourselves, either because we feel as though we've already arrived, or as you pointed out, we're kind of in the hero's journey, or we're like just too tunnel visioned, right, in terms of taking in perspectives of others, which is becoming even more important in the kind of complexity and fast moving environment we're finding our graduates and all of us are trying to influence in.
Right. And that's so important. So you mentioned a little bit about like the research and things that you're doing there at Harvard. Can you talk a little bit about what you're involved in now? So obviously you're doing the teaching, you're doing the How Institute and those. Can you talk a little bit about what you're excited about right now, or where you're spending your time and where you find your purpose and where you're at right now?
Yeah, my complementarity is a word that I like to use because it's how do the things that I say yes to and devote my time and what I have to contribute to, how do they build on each other so they're sort of synergistic? And I summarize my purpose statement into one statement, and it's kick chalks. And if you know that in front of an airplane there are those bricks that you put there for a reason, usually it's a safety because it's, you're refueling or you're loading passengers or you're preparing for the mission. But when it's time to go, you kind of say it's time to kick chocks, and then you literally have to kick them out from under the rubber. That's sort of how I summarize what my purpose is and what I say yes to. Right now, I'm really excited that I get to work with senior executives from mostly senior levels of the federal government, but it's also 20% global, and they're military as well as civilian, and some nonprofit, some private sector. It's a month-long program at Harvard, and it is really about helping these incredibly devoted public servants primarily to be able to have agency and make a positive difference in the world. I'm also working a lot with our veterans, mostly graduate students that are in the Kennedy School of Government, the law school, or the business school at Harvard. And it's hard to make a transition from being active duty or serving as a reserve, or even making a transition from the military to the civilian world. And so I try to help people to kick chocks there, to be able to take off in a new environment and to flourish. And I also find that serving on boards is exciting, because that is really about going into a boardroom with amazing teammates and trying to figure out how to help that industry or that organization to navigate through what are really tough times for many of these organizations, when they're trying to also build upon excellence and to have integrity first, and to serve, to keep the lights on, or to provide transportation, or to advance people's education and their livelihoods for them and their families. So that's sort of what I'm excited about. We're still doing research in terms of now deep diving into personality, looking at the 5-factor model and what we know about that, and how it influences on some of these other outcomes that I mentioned earlier in the research that we've been doing since 2014. So hopefully some contributions coming your way for the journal, again, to share hopefully our excitement about intentionality and measurement and what we're learning and what we still have to learn.
And those are all so critically important, right, in terms of topics that we need to just continue to lean into. As you find yourself across those different areas and those different domains that you're working on, are you seeing some common themes or patterns or things that executives or leaders, kind of regardless of the context that they're struggling with, that you're seeing? Is it that authenticity? Is it that wellness? What are you seeing that keeps coming up as repeating patterns that we need to really continue to work on?
Yeah, it's I would say it's clarity of purpose, and that's at the individual level as well as at the organizational level, because I think it's really hard if you haven't got agreement on your sort of your true north, or in some hemispheres they use just, let's talk about the compass because it might be the southern hemisphere, but it's really about having that conversation, recognizing what each individual member of the executive team or the board are bringing to helping to achieve what it is you have as a shared sense of that clarity of what you're about, and how are you measuring that, so you're approximating that target. I would say it's basically the learning focused model that we use at the Air Force Academy. And I have to say, in all that I'm doing, I have even more sense of I want to say pride, but not in a boastful way, but a sense of really that the Air Force Academy is leading edge in terms of thinking about and applying, developing leaders of character, and how can that, carry on into influencing in other facets in other industries. I think it's the same thing, and it's that alignment.
Is that kind of understanding that alignment, or maybe that lack of alignment, is that a systemic thing that we're missing in our institutions of learning or training or development? Or is it one of those things that's just an individual level construct that we just have to get to a point where we realize that it's not just about what I do, it's who I am, and do that again, right? Like you mentioned at the Academy, a leader of character really talks about who I am and how I'm showing up. Certainly there's a component of, I've got to be able to do what I do very well, right? I've got to be, have excellence and do the right things. But so we kind of show them that kind of mirror a little bit early on in the process. Is that something we're missing in some of our other domains, or what do you think is causing that?
Yeah, I keep thinking about the complexity and simplicity because some of what I think happens is because we measure so much, because we're so interconnected, because there's so much information, we can get basically caught in the complexity, and we don't step back and really ask the simple question. That's why I say the who are we and the why are we question are so important individually and as an organization. Then it makes it easier to be able to put all oars in kind of the water to move, with the
Right.
coxswain on the back, right, in the
Right.
direction that we're trying to go, and know when we're meeting our mile markers or not. I have one example when I was the dean, and among our colleagues, is we looked at all the assessments, right? Because the learning model is, what is it that we're trying to achieve? Like, what is our target? What is it that who are we and why are we? What is it that we, will hit as success, so to speak? Then
Right.
we go about saying, okay, how are we going to hit that target? What is it that we're going to do? What are the courses or the curriculum or the experiences? Then it's, what do we measure? How do we measure to know whether we're, as we feed back into that learning loop? Now, what happened was we were all sitting around looking all the things we were measuring at the Air Force Academy, and we just said it was analysis paralysis, right? And so we
Right.
went back and said the Air Force did this too. Like, what are we training? And it looked at, so many hours of training, but we didn't have people having time because of the required training to actually do their jobs. So
Right.
we had to do an audit and try to figure out what were we measuring for specific purposes that we had to for Congress or other reporting. What are the things we were measuring that were actually helping us define and achieve what it is that we set out as our goals? And it was a really great exercise, and we left a lot of things on the cutting room table that we really just were measuring, wasting people's time. We were not using that data. It wasn't answering a question for us, and there was no reason for us to be doing that. So I think what I'm talking about is the get back to the basics.
Right.
It's simple, but I do think that we get caught into the complexities that are really reality right now with so much information.
Right. I think we get into those habits or those patterns of this is what we've done, this is what we're doing, and then, without giving people time. My guess is in a lot of like the executive leadership and the executive development programs that you have, that idea of reflecting, sitting back, taking the assessments, understanding what that's about is a critical component, right? To give them a pause because it is complex, right? These senior leaders we've got a lot that they're going on, a lot that they're responsible for. It's kind of impossible to know everything that's going on at any time. So, but if we don't have time in our system to kind of step back, take a moment, think about that purpose again, who we are, what are we trying to do, then we just get caught up in that busyness, right? That complexity, and we don't ever get to what's really back to what's important to us.
Yeah, and that is a point. You mentioned the Howe Institute for Society, where I've been able to work with them. It's a nonprofit, and it's about moral leadership in society. And we have a practice that is our founder Dov Seidman talks about in terms of taking a pause. And if you have a machine and you hit the pause button, it stops. But as humans, when we hit a pause button, that's actually when we begin. And so it's a very good practice. And our podcast, actually, the website has a pause app on it. If you look up the Howe Institute for Society to kind of practice the pause. We also have our podcast on moral leadership, which I think our listeners will recognize many of the people I've had the opportunity to interview for that, including, former Secretary Heather Wilson, former Chief of Staff General Dave Goldfein, who's also a classmate, former Chief Master Sergeant of the Air Force, Chief Khalith Wright, and others, along with other service members, Admiral Stavridis, and also Admiral McChrystal, General McChrystal, Admiral McCraven, and others. So it's uplifting, hopefully, to recognize that moral leadership is tough, but there are people out there who are giving examples of at least how they're navigating through what is the gray zone with moral leadership.
Yeah, it is tough, but that doesn't give us an excuse for not trying, right? And continuing to do that. So appreciate the work you're doing on that. So I wonder what. So you're right at the cutting edge. A lot of that, doing the research, being involved, interacting with that. From a personal standpoint, what do you do to stay energized, to stay charged, to figure out kind of what's out there? And, obviously you're involved in doing the good work and the research, but what's your developmental journey look like in terms of, are there podcasts you listen to? Are there things that you do? How do you stay energized to continue to push and lean forward as much as you do?
Yeah, listening, and actually reading. I'm really impressed, and I'll say it again, with the Journal for Character and Leadership Development, that I think is just continually becoming a stronger place where people are publishing about what is really hard work, and that's on leadership and character development. And I have an ear for just listening to people's stories. I try to say I'm listening with my soul, because I am trying to see the thread of the strength of each person and what people are capable of, and what is maybe, and this is really what I think makes me tick, is what is really holding people back or organizations back from reaching their fullest potential. It's also hard for me because I have to ask myself, what is it that's holding me back? What am I what am I not doing, or what am I doing that might be, putting chalks, not just a pause, chalks in front of my wheel, but holding me back from being able to go to whatever my next level of development is. So it's a question I ask myself, as well as I listen to others, and at all levels. I mean, I love listening to younger people and how they're thinking about their lives and their choices. And, with 2 daughters now serving in the military, I get a daily opportunity for that, which is exciting. And I think also for listening to so many senior executives and the things that they're challenged with. And many of them, it's the epidemic, as Jennifer Moss writes about, is the burnout epidemic. We have so many people, and mental health, such a big challenge right now, particularly in the military. So, I think there's a lot of room here to explore, what is holding people and organizations back, ultimately, potentially our democracy. So that keeps me waking up and jumping out of bed in the morning.
Oh, that's awesome. I love that idea of listening, and that whole idea of stories and storytelling. And we could spend another hour just talking about the power of that and what we can learn from that. But you also talked about that idea of kind of those chalks in there. Some of those are actual, some of them are perceived, right? And how do we know the difference, and what can we do with those? So as we kind of wrap up our time here, I wonder if you could go back and spend 5 minutes with Cadet Lindsley at the time when you were a cadet. What advice, or what would you tell yourself then, based on what you know now, to pay attention to think about, or what advice would you give yourself with the benefit of what you've learned along the way?
Yeah, I would like to say, if I told my lieutenant or my cadet Lindsley self, it would have been different, even as a captain or as a major or lieutenant colonel. But I think I would say, bend towards curiosity, and curiosity, ask more questions. Ask for advice, express gratitude. I think that, we've got right now epidemic of a lack of trust of people, lack of trust of, organizations, particularly federal government. And I think so much of our even the polarization that we're seeing globally and within the US, so much of it is based on judgment and not on curiosity. And so, I think that I would have said to myself, including judgment about myself, to remain more curious, to have more of the learning mindset, as Carol Dweck talks about, not a fixed mindset of you either have it or you don't, or have that perception of others, but to be curious. And I think Chat GPT, for people who are playing around with that, one of the things that I'm learning is that it's all on asking good questions. If you don't ask the right questions, you might not get a good answer. So it's always, I think, curiosity and asking good questions is something I'd like to go back and tell Cadet Lindsley to do more of.
Yeah, and then to your point a minute ago is, and then to listen, right? To ask the question and then listen, right? And be able to understand kind of what's going on. Well, I appreciate your time. I appreciate everything. Thank you, General Bourne, for your insights and the conversation today. As a small token of thanks, we will be shipping you a plaque to commemorate our time together today. And so we appreciate that. And we do want to say thank you to everyone who's made this conversation possible. And a special thank you to the Sabre Society members for your support of the Academy and leadership development. Be sure to stay connected on social media and be on the lookout for additional engagement opportunities from the AOG and the Foundation in the coming months. Thank you very much.